Elias Monroe stood on the front porch of the home he had built with his bare hands and his late wife's laughter. The creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet, the scent of magnolias in bloom from the garden she once tended with such pride, and the wind chimes clinking gently in the evening breeze, all of it was part of a life now ending. At 72, Elias had finally retired from his job as a high school history teacher. Not because he wanted to stop working. Teaching had never felt like work, but because his body was slowing down, and his son had insisted he take it easy. "Dad, you've given enough," Brandon had said just months ago, his voice thick with admiration. "Let me take care of things now." Elias had smiled then, heart swelling with pride. Brandon had grown into the kind of man he had hoped to raise. Ambitious, intelligent, a new father himself. When Brandon and his polished, poised wife Lena struggled with the financial demands of a newborn and their cramped apartment, Elias didn't hesitate. He offered them the ultimate gesture of love, his home. "I've got my pension," Elias said, brushing off Brandon's concerns. "The house is fully paid off. It's time for the next generation to live in it, make memories." Brandon had hesitated. Lena had not. "Oh, Elias," she'd cooed, kissing his cheek with cold lips. "You're too generous. We'll take good care of it. We'll make it a home worthy of your legacy." Within weeks, Elias packed his things, though he didn't have much. A few boxes of books, framed photographs, his late wife's favorite shawl. He moved into a small guest room in the basement, content to let the couple have the larger space for their growing family. He thought this was how the rest of his life would unfold, quietly, lovingly, within the orbit of his son's new life. But love, Elias learned, could be conditional. It started subtly. Lena redecorated. Every trace of his late wife vanished. The floral curtains replaced with cold gray blinds. His antique reading chair donated without asking. Then came the whispers behind doors. Discussions that fell silent when Elias entered the room. Averted eyes, half-hearted greetings. The basement door mysteriously left unlocked at night. One morning, Brandon came downstairs, his tone rehearsed and eyes cold. "Dad," he said, not unkindly, "Lena and I have been talking. The baby's sleep schedule is a mess. You going up and down the stairs, it's too much. We just need space." Elias blinked, confused. "I try to stay out of your way." "I know, but it's not just about that. You're old-fashioned, and we want to raise our son in a different kind of environment." Then Lena appeared behind Brandon, arms crossed, face expressionless. "It's time for you to start your next chapter elsewhere. You deserve your independence." "Elsewhere?" Elias repeated softly. "We've already arranged a rental truck," Brandon added, "and we put a deposit on a small studio across town for you. It's cozy." Cozy, a word that sounded like a bullet. Elias looked around the home that still smelled faintly of his wife's favorite lavender soap. The walls that had once held his family's laughter now echoed with betrayal. But he didn't argue. He didn't cry. With his shoulders heavy but his back straight, Elias packed his boxes again, this time with fewer items. No pictures, no shawls. Only what fit into 2 worn suitcases and a banker's envelope of documents he never showed anyone. He left without a fight. No dramatic goodbye, no guilt trips. Just a polite take care of the house and a firm handshake that Brandon barely returned. As the door shut behind him, Brandon let out a sigh of relief and wrapped his arm around Lena. "That was harder than I thought," he murmured. Lena smirked. "It was necessary. This house needs younger energy. And your father? He's part of a life that doesn't fit our future." Across town, Elias sat alone in a run-down motel room, staring out at the flickering neon sign. But behind his calm exterior, something had changed. He was no longer just a retired teacher. He was no longer just a father. He was a man with a secret. And now, with everything he'd built taken from him by the son he loved, Elias would decide what kind of man he truly wanted to be. The motel room Elias settled into was dimly lit, its floral wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the air conditioner moaning like a ghost of better days. The bed was stiff, the faucet leaked, and the only light came from a single overhead bulb that flickered every few minutes. To anyone passing by, Elias Monroe looked like just another discarded old man, forgotten, lonely, broke. But the truth lived beneath the surface, deep beneath the plaid shirts and frayed sleeves, hidden inside a locked drawer of his battered suitcase. It had been years since Elias had even opened the file folder. He sat on the edge of the creaky motel bed, glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and slowly unfolded the stiff papers he'd carried like a ghost for decades. Stock certificates, original investment documents, a formal letter of appreciation from a young man who had once been his student. On the surface, it looked like little more than a forgotten gamble in a dead company, but it wasn't. That student was Caleb Shore, now a renowned tech billionaire, CEO of Shoreline Technologies, a global giant in cloud infrastructure, data systems, and AI development. Caleb had once been a high school dropout on the verge of incarceration, abandoned by his parents and angry at the world. Elias had seen something in him and refused to give up. When Caleb earned his first funding, he sent Elias a thank you letter and offered him a small stake in the startup. Just in case it ever means anything, he had joked. At the time, it had been little more than a symbolic gesture. Now, that forgotten sliver of ownership had quietly turned into a multi-million-dollar share in one of the world's most powerful tech companies. For years, Elias never touched the money. He lived simply, saved his pension, and kept his life modest. He trusted in the warmth of family more than any bank statement. But now that illusion was shattered. His own son had cast him out, trading love for lifestyle. Elias's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from restrained emotion. It wasn't vengeance he felt, not yet. It was grief twisted into purpose. That night, under the flickering motel light, Elias made his first phone call in years to Rosa, a discreet wealth manager he'd worked with quietly over the past decade to handle his shares, taxes, and legal documents. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Monroe," she said with genuine warmth. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Elias said calmly, "but it's time we make a few changes." He arranged a series of transfers, quiet, untraceable, reassigned assets to a private holding company, liquidated just enough to provide for any living expenses, and tucked the rest under layers of trust protections. No paper trail would lead back to him. Not anymore. By the next morning, Elias wasn't just a man with no home. He was a phantom of wealth, wrapped in the skin of a ghost. He began to walk the streets with a new lens. He noticed things he'd never had time to see before, people invisible to the rest of the world. The elderly man sleeping on a bus bench with all his belongings in 2 grocery bags. The mother with bruised arms and 3 children begging outside a pharmacy. The war veteran who saluted every person who passed, hoping someone would see him. Elias saw them, and slowly he began to change, not into someone new, but into the man he had always suppressed, a man unburdened by the need to prove anything to anyone. A man with time, with wealth, and with nothing left to lose. He started small, anonymous donations to a local shelter. A check slipped into a soup kitchen's mailbox. Medical bills paid off for strangers he'd overheard in waiting rooms. Always quiet, always unseen. But behind the kindness was something deeper, a plan forming, a lesson taking shape. Brandon had chosen greed over blood. Lena had turned a home into a house of ambition. They had robbed Elias of dignity, but more tragically, of trust. Now Elias would do what he had never done before. He would stop protecting his son from the consequences of his choices. But he wouldn't seek revenge. No. He would orchestrate something more precise, more powerful, a reckoning dressed as redemption. He picked up a pen and wrote a single phrase in a leather-bound notebook. "He who values the house more than the hands that built it must watch it collapse." He closed the notebook, locked away the documents, and slipped his worn shoes back on. The man they cast out was gone. In his place stood Elias Monroe, the invisible millionaire, quietly writing a story that would one day shake the very ground Brandon walked on. At first glance, Brandon Monroe and his wife Lena were the picture of suburban success. Their newly acquired home, a charming craftsman-style house with white-trimmed windows and a wraparound porch, sat proudly in a quiet cul-de-sac filled with strollers, dog walkers, and two-car garages. Brandon, now the official homeowner, walked with the swagger of a man who believed he had finally made it. He drove a sleek electric SUV leased under his name. He posted Instagram stories from chic brunch spots. He wore designer watches to meetings he barely understood. But the foundation of their picture-perfect life was beginning to rot, and no one was more aware of the cracks than Lena. At first, she was thrilled. The house was everything she'd ever wanted. A symbol of arrival, of elevation, of escape. She wasted no time repainting every room in cold neutrals, hiring an interior designer to rid the space of any trace of Elias's lived-in charm. The family portraits came down. The antique grandfather clock Elias had restored by hand was dragged to the curb. In its place, a $5,000 Scandinavian light fixture no one really needed. But when the excitement faded, reality settled in, and Lena began to see Brandon for what he really was: unpolished, dependent, and increasingly insecure. Brandon's real estate business, which once looked promising on paper, was beginning to fall apart. He had overextended, multiple house flips stuck in limbo, contractors unpaid, investors demanding answers. The cash flow dried up faster than he expected, but pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he doubled down, taking on riskier deals, leasing a second car, and investing in a half-baked crypto venture pitched to him by a guy he met at the gym. At night, the house was quiet, but tense. The baby's cries echoed through sterile hallways, and Brandon's temper became shorter with every missed sale, every overdraft notification. Lena no longer found his boyish charm endearing. She found it embarrassing. She began to spend more time away, first at the yoga studio, then at networking events that Brandon wasn't invited to. Rumors followed, whispered by neighbors behind trimmed hedges. Heard she's spending time with that venture capitalist from the co-working space. Did you see how she looked at the contractor working on the pool? They say she doesn't even wear her wedding ring in public anymore. Meanwhile, Brandon started to drink. Not openly, not the way his father might have called out, but quietly, shamefully. He'd sit in the home office Elias had once used as a reading nook, sipping cheap whiskey from a designer tumbler Lena bought for aesthetic. He'd stare at his reflection in the dark window glass, wondering when exactly things had started slipping. Sometimes he'd think about his father, not with guilt, but with annoyance, with confusion. Why hadn't Elias fought harder to stay? Why had he left so easily? And most importantly, where had he gone? Brandon had sent a few texts. One email. No response. He didn't even know if Elias still had the same phone. Lena, for her part, seemed perfectly content with the silence. "Your father is fine," she'd say flatly whenever Brandon brought him up. "He's an adult. He wanted to leave. You did nothing wrong." But Brandon wasn't so sure anymore, especially when the nightmares began. In them, he stood inside the house, but it was crumbling around him. Walls bleeding water, the floorboards collapsing into darkness, and a distant voice calling his name from the basement. Always the basement. One night, he jolted awake to find the baby screaming and Lena nowhere in sight. Her phone on the nightstand, face down, her shoes gone. By the time she returned hours later, smelling faintly of someone else's cologne, Brandon didn't ask any questions. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, silently watching his golden life rust. And still, in the back of his mind, the smallest voice whispered, "What if Dad knew something we don't?" Something about that thought made his skin crawl. He didn't know it yet, but the world around him was already shifting. Quietly, methodically, and far beyond his control. While Brandon posed for pictures on his perfectly landscaped porch, far across town, in the forgotten wings of a broken shelter and a battered community, a different kind of power was building. one grounded not in appearance, but in patience, strategy, and his father, whom he had underestimated so easily, was watching it all unfold. The city always looked different at dawn. It wore its silence like a worn coat, frayed at the edges, stretched over cracked concrete and blinking neon signs that never slept. Elias Monroe, dressed in a brown corduroy jacket too heavy for spring, walked the back alleys near the industrial district, unnoticed like a shadow that never left the walls. On paper, he was homeless. In truth, he was more anchored than ever. It started with the soup kitchen, Street Alora's. A pale brick building with rusted signage and stained glass windows, long since dulled by grime. Most volunteers came and went, wearing pity in their eyes and gloves on their hands. But Elias stayed. Quietly. Consistently. He never signed up officially. He just showed up, sweeping floors, peeling potatoes, fixing a faulty lock on the food pantry door without asking. Soon, no one questioned his presence. He became part of the bones of the place. And then, he met Delilah Quinn. She arrived one rainy afternoon, storming in with a dripping trench coat and a stack of folders clutched to her chest. Late 40s, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. She spoke like she used to run boardrooms, and she did. Once. Before scandal, grief, and a high-profile divorce turned her from a Manhattan litigation queen into the fiercely guarded manager of a rundown shelter no one else wanted. Delilah didn't trust anyone, so when she first saw Elias, an old man working for free, never asking for help, always listening, never talking, her instincts flared. "You got a last name, mister?" she asked on his third week. "Used to," Elias replied with a small, cryptic smile. That didn't sit well with her. She started watching him, noticing things others missed. The way he handled a kitchen knife like a surgeon, how he never blinked when reading legal forms stuck on the bulletin board, the quiet authority he carried in his posture, like someone used to being listened to. Then there was the donation. A $50,000 anonymous gift wired into St. Alora's Foundation account. No note. No explanation. But it came the same week Elias casually repaired the shelter's busted security system and suggested the installation of encrypted Wi-Fi to protect residents' data. Delilah wasn't stupid. She cornered him one night as he restocked canned beans. "I don't know who you are, but I know what you're not," she said, arms crossed. "And what's that? Homeless, helpless, or harmless?" Elias didn't flinch. He simply closed the cupboard door and met her gaze. "Does it matter? As long as the work gets done?" Delilah respected that. Not because it answered her questions, but because it didn't. She liked mysteries that didn't beg to be solved. Still, she started talking to him more, slowly, over soup, during cleanup. She revealed pieces of her past. The scandal involving her ex-husband's insider trading, the loss of her law license, the brother who died in the foster system she couldn't save. One night, as rain beat hard against the shelter windows, Delilah sat beside Elias in the dining hall, both nursing cups of stale coffee. "You ever think about what you'd do different if you had one more shot?" she asked. Elias stirred his drink. "Only every day." That was when the partnership began. Not in a burst of trust, but in the quiet merging of two people broken in different ways. They didn't make promises. They didn't ask for confessions. But they began to plan. Delilah had connections, dormant legal channels, burner phone contacts, old clients with hidden loyalties. Elias had capital, patience, and a goal. Together, they began to funnel funds from his offshore holdings into legitimate charities disguised as community grants. Tiny loans, medical assistance, school scholarships, all filtered through a foundation under Delilah's name. No one would trace the fortune to him. And yet, slowly, Elias began to spread influence like wildfire, rebuilding communities from the roots up. Not for glory, but for something deeper. Redemption by proxy. Still, Delilah knew there was more. She saw it in the way Elias flinched when children laughed nearby, the hollow look in his eyes when she mentioned family. "You planning to tell me who you're really running from?" she asked one night. "Not running," Elias said. "I'm waiting." "For what?" He looked out the window, where the streetlight flickered above a cracked sidewalk. "For them to fall far enough to see the ground." Delilah didn't press further, she just nodded. But deep down, she was preparing too, because she could feel the storm coming, and she wasn't about to let Elias face it alone. It arrived on a Monday. A plain white envelope, no return address, no stamp. Just Brandon's name, scrawled in old-fashioned cursive across the front. He found it wedged between the front door and the screen, the way someone might slip a note they didn't want the mailman to see. At first, he assumed it was another unpaid invoice or a notice from the HOA about the dying lawn, which Lena had conveniently ignored for weeks. But the second he opened it, the air around him seemed to shift. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, centered. "Your father is watching." Brandon's hands went clammy. He looked around the porch, no one in sight. The street was quiet. A jogger passed by with earbuds in. The baby monitor on his hip crackled faintly from the nursery upstairs. He stepped inside and locked the door. It had been over a year since Elias vanished. Not a single word, not a single trace. Brandon had assumed his father had run off to Florida, or, more likely, faded into some low-income retirement hole. A part of him had even hoped Elias had found peace, because thinking otherwise made the guilt unbearable. But this was something else. Lena laughed when he showed her the letter. "Oh, please," she scoffed, examining it with a dismissive flick of her manicured fingers. "Probably some crank from the shelter or a guilt trip from your church friends. Your father's probably dead in a ditch, Brandon. If he's even alive, he wouldn't waste his time with spooky notes." Brandon didn't argue, but the way she said "your father" made his skin crawl. She never said "dad." She never had. The note wasn't the only odd thing. That week, strange things started happening. Brandon arrived at one of his renovation properties to find the locks changed. His own key no longer worked. When the contractor finally let him in, everything had been cleaned, spotless. Furniture covered, tools organized, and on the kitchen counter, a cup of chamomile tea still warm. No one admitted to being there. Security cameras? Disabled. At another property, the permits, long overdue, were mysteriously approved. A call to the city clerk revealed nothing unusual, just a push from upstairs. No explanation. It wasn't just Brandon's world that felt unsettled. Lena had become more secretive than usual. She claimed she was consulting on a friend's fashion startup, but Brandon saw the credit card bills. Thousands spent on expensive lunches, rideshare services to parts of the city she never mentioned, and most curiously, multiple payments to a private investigator named R. Castell. Brandon asked her once, directly, "Are you digging into my dad?" She didn't lie, she just smirked. Shouldn't someone be? That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. He walked the halls of the house his father had once filled with jazz records and the scent of fresh coffee. But the house felt colder now, emptier. The floorboards groaned louder. Shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners. In the study, the old bookshelf Elias had installed decades ago still stood, untouched and out of place amid Lena's modern aesthetic. Something compelled Brandon to run his fingers along the edges. He found it by accident, a false panel at the back. Inside, a faded envelope, older than the one from earlier, sealed with a wax stamp he didn't recognize. No name. Just a note inside, in Elias's unmistakable handwriting. "If you found this, you've already lost something you didn't even know you had." Brandon slumped into the leather armchair, heart pounding. He suddenly felt like a trespasser in his own home. Who was his father, really? What else had he missed? Meanwhile, across town, in a dimly lit cafe where the staff knew not to ask questions, Lena met with R. Castell, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers and eyes like rusted nails. "He's alive," Castell whispered, sliding over a grainy photo. Elias. Standing outside a shelter, talking to a woman Lena didn't recognize, Smiling, Lena's eyes narrowed. "Find out where he gets his money," she said coldly. "I don't care how long it takes, I want everything." What she didn't know was that someone else had already been watching her. Someone with more history than she could possibly imagine. And for Elias Monroe, the shadows that followed his past were no longer content to stay buried. Brandon's world was unraveling faster than he could blink. His real estate ventures, once the golden promise of his future, were now tangled in a web of debt and lawsuits. Creditors called at all hours. Contractors demanded payment. Investors sent angry letters. The luxurious veneer of his life was cracking, revealing the fragile skeleton beneath. One evening, as Brandon sat in his empty home office, bare except for a half-empty bottle of bourbon and a stack of unopened bills, a sharp knock jolted him. A man in a tailored gray suit stood at the door, a professional smile stretched thin across his face. "Mr. Monroe? I'm Jacob Wolf, private investigator. Ms. Lena Monroe has hired me." Brandon blinked. "To do what?" "To look into your father's affairs," Wolf said. "There are concerns about undisclosed assets." Brandon's heart skipped. He'd suspected Lena was digging, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold ripple through his veins. "Assets?" Brandon scoffed. "Dad had nothing but the house." Wolf shook his head, producing a tablet. "Not quite. We traced an offshore account tied to your father, valued at over $12 million. The room spun. Brandon couldn't reconcile the image of his humble, retired teacher father with a secret millionaire. The father he thought he knew was a stranger. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Lena was savoring her newfound leverage. She arranged a discreet meeting with Wolf at a high-rise cafe overlooking the skyline, her eyes gleaming with the promise of control. "This changes everything," she whispered, fingers tapping impatiently. "Find out where the money is. I want it all. Offshore, onshore, hidden under mattresses, whatever it takes." Wolf nodded, accustomed to deals made in shadowed corners. But Lena wasn't the only one in the shadows. Gerald Whitman, the bitter brother of Elias's late wife, had been watching too. He'd spent years nursing a grudge against Elias, blaming him for financial ruin and the loss of everything Gerald believed was rightfully his. Gerald's office was a cluttered chaos of old photographs, legal documents, and surveillance prints. His eyes, sharp and tired, scanned the latest report from a private investigator he'd hired. "Elias Monroe has assets," the investigator reported. "He's been quietly moving money through shell companies and charitable foundations. It's complicated. He's covered his tracks well." Gerald slammed his fist on the desk. "Complicated or not, I'm going to find it." His obsession had consumed him. Once a promising businessman, Gerald had lost everything after a scandal that tore apart the family fortune. He saw Elias not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of his downfall. The news about Lena's investigations sparked an idea. If he could align with her, use her inside knowledge of Elias's family and finances, they might unearth the fortune together. It was a dangerous alliance, fueled by mutual greed and old wounds. Back at the shelter where Elias had started rebuilding his life, Delilah sensed the tightening noose. "Someone's digging into Elias," she told him one afternoon, her voice low but urgent. "Not just your son or his wife, someone with deeper grudges and darker intentions." Elias nodded, the weight of years settling heavier on his shoulders. "They don't know what they're stepping into," he said quietly, "but soon they will." He began reviewing his offshore accounts and the charitable foundations he'd created in his late wife's name. Secure vehicles for his wealth, designed to help struggling families, but also his last line of defense. The game was no longer about secrecy. It was about survival. The money had become a beacon, a prize that would draw out enemies long buried in the past. And with Brandon's empire collapsing, Lena's greed intensifying, and Gerald's thirst for vengeance growing, the stage was set for a battle that would expose every lie, every betrayal, and every secret Elias had hidden away. In the shadows, the web was tightening, and no one would escape unscathed. The rain hammered relentlessly against the narrow windows of the shelter, casting a relentless rhythm that echoed the storm brewing within Elias Monroe's heart. The steady drip of water outside mirrored the weight of decades-old regrets that had finally caught up with him. Delilah sat opposite Elias in the dimly lit back room, the glow from a single lamp revealing lines of fatigue etched deeply into her face. She had pushed hard to get him to open up, insisting that secrets held in silence become chains. "Elias," she said softly, "I need to know everything. If we're going to face what's coming, you have to tell me your story. No more half-truths." He looked up, eyes weary but resolute. Slowly, he nodded. The past unspooled like an old film reel. Years ago, before Elias was the quiet teacher everyone knew, before his life was shattered by grief and betrayal, there had been a choice. One that had fractured his family in ways no one understood. Gerald Whitman, brother to Elias's late wife Margaret, had once been a trusted confidant. The three men had been bound not just by marriage, but by shared business ventures and promises of prosperity. But greed and pride were poisonous seeds. When Gerald's own ventures collapsed under the weight of bad debts and reckless gambles, he turned to Elias, not for help, but for a scapegoat. Gerald claimed Elias had withheld critical funds, that he had stolen what should have been Gerald's inheritance. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Elias had made a difficult decision at a crossroads. He had the power to save Gerald from financial ruin, but doing so would have meant risking the modest security of his own family and the fragile future he was building for Margaret and their son. He chose to protect his family. Gerald lost everything. The bitter fallout shattered years of trust. "I could have saved him," Elias said, voice heavy with remorse. "But I didn't. I thought protecting my family was the only choice." Delilah's eyes searched his. "And Margaret?" "She stood by me for a time. But Gerald's bitterness poisoned the well. Our marriage cracked. She passed before the wounds fully healed." The room grew silent. Then, Elias revealed the truth no one else knew. Gerald had been watching, waiting for his chance to strike. When Lena's name came up in conversation, her greed, her secret investigations, Elias's face darkened. "She's a wildfire," he said. "And Gerald, he's a storm. Together, they could consume everything I've built." Delilah's mind raced. An alliance between Gerald and Lena could be deadly, and it was already forming. Meanwhile, in a shadowed hotel room far from the city's bustling streets, Gerald Whitman sat across from a woman who knew more about Elias Monroe's finances than anyone else. Maps, spreadsheets, and bank statements littered the table. Gerald's fingers traced lines of transactions, hidden accounts, and charitable fronts. "She's playing a dangerous game," Gerald muttered, his voice low. "But she's useful." The woman smiled thinly. "Lena's ambition blinds her, but it makes her bold. She'll do anything for the money. We use that." Together they plotted to seize Elias's fortune, no matter the cost. Gerald's thirst for revenge had evolved into an obsession, one fueled by years of humiliation, loss, and a relentless desire to reclaim what he believed was his. Back at the shelter, Delilah made a decision. "We need a plan," she said firmly. "You've been preparing quietly, but now we face a storm you can't weather alone." Elias nodded, grateful for her fierce loyalty. "For Brandon's sake," he said. "For the family I lost and the one I thought I had." Delilah reached into her bag and pulled out a folder filled with documents, legal filings, bank transfers, and security protocols. "We'll protect the foundation and your legacy," she said, "but first we must outsmart those who hunt you." Elias's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and determination. The past was unforgiving, but the future, fragile and uncertain, was still theirs to shape. As rain continued to fall outside, Elias and Delilah prepared for the inevitable clash. The sins of the past were no longer buried. They were coming alive, and the consequences would be devastating. Brandon Monroe hadn't shaved in days. His tailored suits had been replaced with wrinkled shirts and scuffed shoes. The grand entrance of the house Elias had given him, the one that once symbolized status and success, now echoed hollow with emptiness. Lena was gone. The baby's laughter no longer echoed through the halls. And the man who had once strutted through life like he owned it all was now reduced to whispers and shadows. It had happened quickly, yet somehow painfully slow, like drowning. After Lena's mysterious disappearance, Brandon discovered she'd drained their joint accounts, transferred assets to her name, and sold off the second car without so much as a goodbye. The deed to the house was missing. The only thing she left was a handwritten note scrawled on hotel stationery. "You built this on lies. I'm just cashing in. L." The bank froze his business accounts the same day. A week later, a sheriff's deputy taped an eviction notice to the front door. He was being kicked out of the house his father had given him, the same man he'd dismissed, disrespected, evicted. Guilt clung to him like a second skin now. Every sleepless night drove the memory of Elias deeper into his soul. His quiet, weathered face, the way he handed over the house keys like they were sacred, never asking for anything in return. Brandon had thrown it all away for ambition, for Lena, for appearances. And now he had nothing. No wife, no business, no future. For the first time in his life, Brandon Monroe was truly alone. He spent 3 days wandering, sleeping in his car, reeking of sweat and shame. Then, like a whisper from the past, he remembered something. A memory buried deep. Elias once mentioned an apartment he used to rent before the house was fully paid off. A modest building near the old train station. Brandon had dismissed it then as another of his father's boring, humble man stories. Now, he clung to it like a lifeline. He stood in front of the faded brownstone at dusk, hesitant. He didn't even know if Elias lived there, but somehow he felt it. The place had the quiet dignity Elias always carried, understated and weathered, but alive. Brandon climbed the steps, his heart pounding. He knocked once, no answer. He knocked again, longer this time. Then the door opened. Elias stood in the doorway, older than Brandon remembered, with deeper lines carved into his face, but the same steady gaze. He said nothing, just looked at his son, disheveled, hollow-eyed, trembling. "Dad," Brandon's voice cracked. I didn't know where else to go." Elias didn't move. "I messed up," Brandon said. "Lena's gone. The business, the house, it's all gone." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Elias stepped aside and gestured for Brandon to come in. The apartment was simple, clean, sparse, a few framed photographs on the shelf, a cup of tea cooling on the table. There was no sign of luxury, no indication of the wealth Elias secretly held, just warmth and stillness. Brandon sat down on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I was greedy. I let her convince me you were holding us back, that we deserved more. I thought giving you the boot would help us grow. Instead," he couldn't finish the sentence. Elias sat across from him, hands clasped. "I gave you everything I had," he said softly. "Not the money, the trust. That's what hurts the most." Brandon's face crumpled. "I know, and I'm sorry." Silence returned. Then Elias leaned forward. "You want a place to sleep? Fine, but I'm not handing out comfort. If you want to rebuild, you'll do it the hard way, the right way." Brandon looked up, confused. Elias pulled out a small, folded flyer from his jacket and handed it over. It was from the local soup kitchen. "You'll volunteer there, every day, no exceptions. You'll show up early, clean, work without complaint. That's your rent?" Brandon blinked. "You're serious?" As a heart attack, Brandon considered arguing, but he saw something in his father's eyes, a quiet strength, the same kind he once mistook for weakness. Now he understood it was something rarer, dignity. He nodded. "I'll do it." Elias stood and walked to the kitchen. "You can sleep on the pull-out couch. Sheets are in the closet. Lights out by 10. As Elias poured himself another cup of tea, Brandon sat alone, stunned by how quickly the world could flip. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely lost. He'd lost the house, the money, and the illusion. But maybe, just maybe, he could still find his soul. The plan was in motion. It had taken months of silence, patience, and trust in the unseen. But Elias and Delilah had built a fortress hidden in plain sight. The fortune Elias had amassed over decades sat like a glowing ember in the shadows, untouchable. But now, the vultures had circled too close, and it was time to light the fire. Lena's betrayal had not gone unnoticed, least of all by Delilah. Through legal channels and quiet digital surveillance, Delilah tracked every move Lena made after she vanished from Brandon's life. She wasn't hiding, she was hunting. And she wasn't alone. Gerald Whitman had emerged like a ghost from Elias's past, and now he stood at Lena's side, bitter, cunning, and determined. Their alliance was born of greed and rot. She brought the access, he brought the rage. Together, they had found the keyhole to Elias's secret. But they didn't realize the lock had been changed. Late one night, inside a secure condo far from the city center, Lena and Gerald sat before a laptop, eyes locked on the offshore accounts they believed would change their lives forever. Gerald leaned in, hands trembling with anticipation. "Are you sure this is it?" Lena smirked. "Positive. The shell corporations, the trust in Margaret's name, the routing paths, I've traced them all." Elias didn't cover his tracks as well as he thought. She entered the last passphrase, an obscure quote from one of Elias's old lesson plans she remembered reading in Brandon's files, and the screen shifted. Access granted. Her jaw dropped. Gerald let out a low whistle. Before them was a digital vault, $46 million. It was real. It was breathtaking. And it was bait. "Let's move it," Lena whispered, her voice quivering. "We split it and vanish. He'll never know what hit him." But the moment she initiated the transfer, the screen flickered. Suddenly, a message appeared in bold red letters across the screen. "Nice try. But I always grade final exams. E.M." The laptop powered down, the lights flickered. And then, the sound of sirens. Lena bolted upright, heart pounding. What the hell is this? Gerald grabbed the laptop and smashed it against the wall. But it was too late. The trap had sprung. Hidden trackers. Traced logins. An alert system routed through layers of encrypted legal defense. Across the city, Delilah stood in the control room of the Foundation's legal office, watching the breach on a wall of monitors. She exhaled. "They took the bait," she said into the phone. "You were right. They went for Margaret's fund." On the other end, Elias sat in silence. It had worked. Instead of hiding the fortune offshore, as Gerald and Lena assumed, Elias had transferred the bulk of it into a philanthropic foundation named in honor of his late wife, Margaret Monroe Family Initiative. It focused on housing assistance, education grants, and legal services for struggling families. The money was managed and legally protected by Delilah and a small board of trusted allies. It couldn't be stolen, it couldn't be transferred, and it couldn't be touched without triggering federal oversight. Lena and Gerald hadn't just tried to steal money, they had attempted to breach a federally registered charitable trust. That meant felony charges. Within hours, Lena was arrested trying to board a private flight under an alias. Her screams as she was led away in cuffs were captured on a nearby journalist's cell phone and would later go viral. Gerald, however, slipped through the net. He vanished without a trace, no credit card activity, no phone usage, no witnesses. Elias knew this wasn't over. A man like Gerald didn't disappear. He waited. But Elias didn't focus on that just yet. There was something poetic about the trap closing, not with vengeance, but with purpose. His fortune now served the people who needed it most. Those forgotten by society, just as he had once been forgotten by his own family. And Brandon? He was still working in the soup kitchen, quietly, earnestly. No headlines, no glory, just humility. Elias stood in the doorway one afternoon, watching from afar. Delilah joined him, arms crossed. "You did good," she said softly. He nodded. "He's not there yet, but he's trying." "Maybe that's enough." Elias didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on Brandon, serving hot soup to a child with the same gentle smile Elias once wore in a classroom. It was the first real smile Elias had seen on his son in years. But as peace began to return, a letter arrived on Elias's doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single line. "You're not the only one with a legacy, Elias. You have another child." His hands trembled. The fire may have ended, but the smoke hadn't cleared. Elias Monroe sat at his small kitchen table, the pale morning light spilling across the worn wood. The envelope lay before him like a snake, still unopened, its single sentence echoing in his mind. "You're not the only one with a legacy, Elias. You have another child." He hadn't slept. Memories swirled. Margaret's laughter in the old house, the scent of lemon balm from her garden, the sound of Brandon's first cries, and now, this. Another child? A life he had never known? He turned the envelope over again. No return address. The paper was expensive, watermarked, professional. Not a prank. Not likely from Gerald either. This was too restrained, too deliberate. The handwriting was clean, measured, as if the writer had waited a long time to say something important. He finally opened it. Inside was a single photograph. A young woman, mid-30s perhaps, standing on the steps of a courthouse. She had eyes that felt too familiar. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. There was no name. Just another message scribbled on the back of the photo. "You taught your students about justice. She teaches the law." The next day, Elias walked into the soup kitchen as usual. Brandon was already there, sleeves rolled up, helping a line of volunteers unpack canned goods. Brandon glanced up and nodded. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of nod between equals, not just blood. The tension that once poisoned every glance had begun to dissolve over the past weeks. Slowly, Brandon was becoming the man Elias had always hoped he might be. Still, Elias hadn't told him everything. Not about the fortune, not about Lena's arrest or Gerald's disappearance, not about the letter. Not yet. "Hey, Dad," Brandon called. "We're short on bread. Want to ride with me to the donation center?" "Sure," Elias replied. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the road offering space to think. "You know," Brandon said, eyes still on the road, "I used to think having money fixed everything. Now I see how it almost broke me." Elias gave a dry chuckle. "Almost?" Brandon glanced at him, then smiled. "Maybe it did, but I'm working on unbreaking it." They unloaded crates in the warm afternoon sun, side by side, like two men building something real. By the time they returned to the soup kitchen, a woman stood outside, holding a slim briefcase and wearing a navy blazer over jeans. Her posture was upright, confident, but not stiff. She turned when she saw Elias. He froze. She had Margaret's jawline, his eyes. "Mr. Monroe?" she asked gently. Brandon looked between them, confused. "Dad, who is this?" The woman stepped forward and extended a hand. "My name is Camille. I'm an attorney, and I believe I'm your daughter." The air left Elias's lungs. Camille opened her briefcase and pulled out documents. Court-certified DNA tests, a letter from her late mother, and a well-worn photograph of a young Elias, standing beside a woman Elias hadn't seen in over 35 years. He remembered her now, Jocelyn. A brief affair, born in grief, shortly after Margaret's passing but long before Elias had regained his footing. She'd left town soon after, never asking for anything, And now, here stood the consequence, and perhaps the gift, of that forgotten chapter. Elias sat down slowly. "You knew for how long?" "I found out 6 months ago," Camille said. "I didn't want to come forward until I was sure. I'm not after money. I'm here because I wanted to know where I came from." Brandon looked stunned. His mouth opened, then closed again. He walked out onto the sidewalk, needing air. Camille watched him go, then turned back to Elias. "You've built something beautiful here, and I'd like to help you protect it." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Why?" She smiled. "Because you're not the only one who believes money should serve something greater than pride." And then, for the first time in a long time, Elias laughed. Not bitter, not cynical, full-hearted. The legacy he had feared would die with betrayal was still alive, just transformed. That night, Elias sat in the empty soup kitchen after closing, alone with the silence. He reached into his coat and pulled out 2 sealed envelopes. One had Brandon's name, the other, Camille's. Inside each was a letter. Nothing legal, nothing about the foundation or money. Just words. His words. About trust, about family. About redemption earned, not given. As he sealed the last envelope, he felt it, that unfamiliar, fragile emotion rising in his chest. Hope. Maybe he hadn't failed as a father. Maybe he had simply taken the long road home.